I mentioned this morning as we brought to closure, Cynthia Bourgeot, in her, it's not the only place she mentions it, but in the Heart of Centering Prayer, she begins to speak about the human condition. And goes on to say that within the human condition, we have two operating systems. Not either or, but both and. And then she goes on to mention, and what I like about it, I like about her way of doing it, is that she describes the ego, I think, in a very positive way. And I'll just offer you her description. And then she invites us to go deeper and to be aware that on the deepest level, or within the deepest part of ourselves, the other operation is what is described as heartfulness, the place of the heart, the deepest part of ourselves, where God lives and moves and has God's being. Within. We are all mystics. God has chosen to pitch God's tent within the fertile soil of our hearts. And worthiness has nothing to do with it. It really is all about God and the intensity of God's love. And love, perfect love, authentic love, has to be expressed. You can't hold it in. And that's how God's love is being expressed. We've just gone through the meeting in Glasgow and coming to a much deeper awareness that God not only has, from a faith perspective, we have a scientific perspective which we respect, but the faith perspective assures us that the love of God that chose to express itself, that love resulted in all of creation. That love has resulted in the entire cosmos. And what some spiritual teachers are saying, and I love this, God's love did not only bring into being all it is, and God's love not only sustains in being all that is, but God's love permeates and penetrates every fiber of creation. God, as one Jesuit suggests, God is present in the grain of sand. We stand on holy ground. Why are we concerned? Why would we want to be involved in doing what we can do to help the planet? God is present. And that puts into dialogue all of the other ways that we may abuse the planet, consciously or unconsciously. What could motivate us to kind of step back and take another look? And again, we're in this together. What do you want for your children or your grandchildren? It's huge. It's a huge issue. And there's no point in, putting your head in the sand or just going back into your head and having another fight. What's going on? And my point is God is present. God is present in all it is. So we're upheld. We're upheld. We're never, ever separated from the presence, the love, the action of God, because Thomas Keating would say with tongue in cheek years ago, what do you think would happen to you or to me or to us if for a nanosecond, God took God's gaze off of us? And then he'd answer his own question. You'd become a grease spot. You'd no longer exist. You're upheld in existence. And that's where the pandemic teaching this, we're pretty dependent. We're not, muscular Christianity doesn't work. It really doesn't over the long haul. So that's one, I think, I find it very compelling. And the people that are writing more and more about this would be people like Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit scientist who was a very faith-filled Jesuit, who began to describe that the love of God is permeating and preserving and enhancing this process of evolution that we are all a part of. We are living in and through a process of evolution. We've come from God and we're returning to God. That's what it's all about. And we're doing this not as splendid individuals or isolated individuals. We're doing this as a human community. We are in this together. We are all one. This is, to me, this is some of the material that's surfacing that gives me such a sense of optimism, such a sense of joy and gratitude, and I want to be a part of this. This is great stuff. Why wouldn't you want to be a part of it? Co-creators. Get off your duff. We're called to co-labor. That's Ignatius's great phrase. We're called to co-labor with the risen Christ in building up the kingdom of God, a kingdom of justice and peace and love. You know, wow. That's our vocation on the deepest level. So that would be one piece that I just offered to you as foundational. And then when Cynthia invites us again to go back to the two operating systems, she begins by saying, and again, a lot of life experience reinforces this for me in relationship to counseling and spiritual direction over many, many years, that one of our life tasks, a developmental task, is that God invites us to cultivate a healthy sense of egoic identity. That is a significant part of our call. That as we grow and develop, we begin to cultivate a healthy sense of egoic identity by simply becoming aware of the gifts and the talents that God has blessed each one of us. And we develop those talents through education, through formation, through life experience. And developing those gifts and those talents give to us a sense, a healthy sense of egoic identity. And if one has not developed a healthy sense of egoic identity, they really run the risk of living life as a victim. As a victim. That's a heartbreak. That's not God's will. You know, so really, really important. Developing the gifts, the talents, and it's through the development of those gifts and those talents that we're making our contribution to ourselves, to our profession, whatever that profession might be, to our family, to the relationships in our lives. This is how we do it. Richard Rohr and Ron Rolheiser would simply say, this is a task more related to the first half of life. That makes sense. You know, you're going to college, you're going to school, whatever, you know, you're kind of finding your place. And what do I really want to do? You know, that kind of motivation. So I find it both energizing and exciting the way she puts that together. My only hesitancy, and I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but I think it has to be mentioned, as she's developing this very positive approach to egoic development, she mentions almost as a by the way, and the false self system is part of the ego. Well, if you delved into the teaching of Father Thomas Merton, Father Thomas Keating, that paradigm of true self, false self is very much permeating and penetrating our egoic development. And we just have to be aware of that. And how do we become aware of that? Well, that's been one of the great blessings of contemplative outreach. How do we become more aware of it? By choosing to cultivate in our lives spiritual practices that are all about relationship, but they're spiritual practices that help to bring us beneath the head to the deepest level of the heart, where God lives and moves and has God's being. So if we had more time, I would be able to kind of, you've gone through, I mean, if you've looked at the videos and read any of Father Keating's works, he puts an awful lot of emphasis on the development of the false self system. And again, he does that, as far as I'm concerned, with a great deal of compassion. He said, well, what is the origin of the false self system? And he goes on to point out, from an evolutionary or developmental point of view, when we come to full self-conscious awareness, now this is very psychological, but try it on. Don't react. We come to full self-conscious awareness without a corresponding felt sense of the presence of God. This is Thomas Keating's effort in a contemporary way to describe the effects of what traditionally we have described as original sin. There's something wrong. There's something wrong. We kind of, and then he goes on to say, from the point of view of compensating, how do you compensate when you have that feeling of existential dread or anxiety, or, you're all by yourself, you're feeling very alone, even at a very young age? You begin to develop emotional programs for happiness that simply do not work. And the emotional programs for happiness are the exaggerated demand for power control. So I always say to the folks, gee, how's it going? Do you have any control issues? Ah! Well, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Of course you do, we all do. But that's the work. You gotta work with this stuff. And that's what the practices do. They help us work through these experiences. The exaggerated demand for power control, the exaggerated demand for affection, esteem, approval. Dodie talked a bit about that this morning. The deprivation, in terms of family of origin. I mean, God forgive me, my mother was a saint. But one of my issues as a little one, 5, 6, 7, when I would come home from school, I would come into an empty house. What does that feel like to a little tyke? The 25-cent word is abandonment. Where was my mother? She was out in our mom and pop grocery store, right next to the house. But the experience was empty house, feeling of abandonment. And I certainly compensated. Because I have a wonderful personality. Don't you really like me? Don't you think I'm terrific? I've used it until someone like Thomas Keating cut to the quick. And I could hear again, grow up. What's going on? And so you work with it. It's really, it's the life task. And the tendency is projection. It's everybody else's fault. Whatever's going on inside of you is your stuff. Whatever it is. So just work with it. God's with you. God's not trying to set you up for discouragement.